Politicians are blaming landlords for record high rents in New York City, but the true cause is legislation that the politicians passed themselves. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over the topic that is one of the things that I focus on a lot, and that's rent control. Okay, now, right now, the rents up in New York City, they're reaching record highs. I mean, rent is very, very expensive. And people are, at first they were like, hey, things are popping back after the pandemic and, they're getting back to normal. Now it is going into the catastrophically expensive, realm. And they're like, well, what's the cause of this? What's the cause of this? It's rent control. The rent control policies that the politicians put in place in New York are limiting the supply, and that is causing, with a huge amount of demand for people who are moving back into the city, etc., that is causing huge, huge issues. And that means that the cost of rent there has skyrocketed. And one of the articles I'm going over today is actually going to be talking about why, exactly why the rent control is doing this to the market. Now, the other article I have, it's going to be going over just the facts about how much the market has, just blown up in New York, right? And the interesting thing is, this is happening all over the country, right? But it's being really, really bad up in New York City just because of these policies. Creating policies that make it so that developers don't want to build, that people don't want to rent out their properties and don't want to be landlords. Those are the things that cause there to be a shortage of affordable housing, okay? What you have to do is you have to make it incentivize people to want to be landlords if you want there to be more housing. I mean, it's pretty simple, okay? But before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what you think, okay? Do you believe that rent control is to blame for the skyrocketing rents up in New York? Or is it something else? Is it Ukraine? Is it, the inflation that's going on? Is it, what do you think it is, okay? I think rent control is dead center to blame, and then the other things, they're only exacerbating the issue and making it worse, okay? They are not helping, but they are not the root cause of the expensive housing up there. So let's get into this first article, right? And it's coming from The Real Deal, and it says, New York City rents soar as COVID deals die. All right, let's get into it. Rents in New York soared so high in April that even discounted leases hit new heights. Net effective median rent on a unit with concessions in Manhattan hit a new high last month of $3,870, according to a monthly report by appraisal firm Miller Samuel for Douglas Elliman. The price point marks the highest annual surge rate on record, nearly 39% above April 2021 levels. That increase comes as so-called COVID deals that drew tenants back to the city last year continue to expire. Concessions aside, Manhattan median rents notched a fresh high of $3,925 in April, surging over 6% to outshine the previous record of $3,700 held in February and March. Yeah. Okay, rents are going up, and the only reason that rents are going up in a place like New York that has rent control is because 2/3 of the housing stock there is not underneath rent control. That 1/3 that is, if you're one of the lucky few who lives in a rent-controlled unit, then you're golden. You got your rent regulated. You don't have anything to worry about, but you can't move anywhere. You're just basically stuck in that unit because you won't find another one. So, if you're new to the city, you can't find a rent-controlled unit. You're probably going to end up in an unregulated unit paying this nearly $4,000 a month to live there. Just to give you a perspective of how much this rent is if you're not from New York City, right? So, it says the average rent was almost $4,000 a month. Well, here, I know Nebraska and New York don't compare, but I like to throw it out there anyway. I own a house here in Nebraska, 4,000 square feet, 5 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, backs up to a lake, and my house payment is $3,000 a month. Okay, so, if you want to compare that to a New York City apartment, yeah, you've got the nightlife, you've got the city, you've got all the excitement and all that. I got no problems with New York. I like visiting there, but there is no way that I think it's worth paying $4,000 a month to live there. Okay? And I'll stand by that, okay? And I make plenty of money. I could easily live there if I wanted to, but I don't want to. I'd much rather have my big house here in Nebraska. But it really is bad up there, and the prices are going to continue to rise. And, like I said, the problem is supply and demand. There's a large demand, and there is not a lot of supply, and that is caused by the rent control. And that brings me into the second article. And this one is coming from the City Journal, and it says, "Throwing sand in the works. New York City and state rent control policy is sabotaging post-pandemic recovery." Okay, and this article is the true focus of the video. So let's get into it. New York City's YIMBY, yes in my backyard, housing contingent was abuzz last week as Urban Digs, a proprietary real estate information service, noted that Manhattan rents for April 2022 exceeded pre-pandemic levels by 20%, while the inventory of apartments for rent stood at a record low. While other metrics yield somewhat different results about how far rents and inventories have rebounded from their pre-pandemic lows, the data agree about the general trend. Inventories of apartments for rent are plummeting, and rents are at or near record highs. Spiking rents and low inventories are the predictable consequences of the 2019 tightening of rent controls by the New York State legislature. The media has focused on the timid, yet still highly controversial efforts by the city's Rent Guidelines Board to permit rent increases that compensate landlords, at least partially, for rising inflation. But few are paying attention to the looming crisis of the recovering economy running headlong into New York City's tight regulations on both the price and quantity of housing stock. Economic theory tells us this must lead to housing shortages and sharply escalating rents, and that is exactly what is happening. Yeah, I covered a video just a short while ago about the itty-bitty rent increases that they're going to allow New York landlords who have rent-controlled units to have. I believe for 1 to 2, I think it's a 1 to 2 year lease, you can do 2 to 4%. And then for a 1-year lease is 2 to 4%. And then a 2-year lease would be 4 to 6%. So the problem with that is that obviously, inflation is over 8% right now. So even increasing your rents at the maximum, if you're able to increase your rents by 6%, you're still not keeping pace with inflation if you're a New York landlord with a rent controlled unit. And the funny thing that they don't mention is, a lot of the landlords with these rent-controlled units are small landlords, okay? I think the article that I covered last time said that 50% of the rent-controlled units are owned by small landlords, not the big corporate players like they think. So, this can be an absolute disaster for someone who, is struggling to get the repairs done and keep their property up to date, And, simply put, just like this article says, right? Economic theory says that, simply put, they're putting these price controls and, not allowing builders to build and all that. That is going to cause the huge rent increases that they're talking about. Government's fundamental interest in housing policy is to ensure that the economy's demand for labor is matched by the availability of decent housing in the location where jobs are being created. In New York State, it's no mystery where the jobs are, largely within New York City and to a lesser extent in the downstate suburbs. In 2019, however, the legislature decided that the goal of state housing policy would be not to ensure adequate supply, but to keep households that already have housing from being forced to move because of rents rising faster than the rate of cost inflation, as defined by the Rent Guidelines Board. The need to find housing for the growing downstate labor force would count for nothing. Yeah, so the politicians, instead of thinking, hey, we need to have enough housing so that, for all these people who are moving down here to the New York area, they have somewhere to live, they thought, well, for the people who are already here, we just want to keep housing cheap. Well, that's not a good solution. The best way to keep housing cheap for the people who already live there would be to build a ton of new housing, right? But they didn't think about that. The problem is, right, the politicians, they're not worried about people moving in to the area. They're worried about the voters they have right now. That's all they care about is the votes. And they know that, hey, a rent control policy, it's good for getting votes because there's more renters than there are owners, especially in a place like New York City. It wasn't until Governor Kathy Hochul replaced Andrew Cuomo, who signed the rent bill, that the legislature even considered a package of supply-side housing reforms that might help enable the downstate region to continue growing past its pre-pandemic employment levels. But the legislature quickly dropped these reforms, and it's not clear that it will pass any pro-housing supply legislation this year. Mayor Eric Adams, furthermore, has yet to announce any zoning reforms that the city might undertake to release its stranglehold on the housing supply. Defenders of rent regulation might argue that the current supply stagnation shouldn't be a problem. The city's unemployment rate was 6.1% in March, much higher than the national average of 3.6%. The economy should continue to grow as the unemployed are rehired, regardless of the protections from rent increases. Yeah, but it's not that simple, though. The economy of early 2022 is structurally different than that of early 2020 before the pandemic. As of March 2022, total employment in the city was about 4.4 million, roughly equivalent to the level of March 2017, but about 200,000 below the level of March 2020. So, basically, they have a lot of arguments of why they don't need to build more housing, how they can have these rent control policies in place, and you know what? All of it is garbage, okay? It's all garbage, and all they have to do is look at the results, okay? Skyrocketing rents, highest rents in the entire country, and what is the cause? The cause is they can't build enough housing, okay? They can't build the housing because of the government regulations that they've put into place, because of all the rules and hoops they have to jump through, and they've made it darn near impossible. Plus, why would you want to? A lot of these landlords aren't making any money. A lot of the developers, you're taking away their ability to make any money. And so they're like, well, why am I going to rent my property out? Why am I going to do any of this? This is ridiculous. I don't want to have to deal with all of this government regulation, So I'm going to skip down a little bit in here and get closer to the end because this video is going a little bit long. And it says, New York hasn't tried this approach in decades. As a result, contrary messages muffle labor market signals. To the less skilled unemployed, the overriding signal is, don't move out of the city and give up your bargain apartment or you'll never be able to move back. To those with more earning potential, it's move to New York and you'll get in a bidding war with a dozen other people for an apartment that's not even very attractive. So why bother? So yeah, they've created policies where if you are, a low-income person who already, lives in New York in one of these rent-controlled units, well, you can never leave, essentially, right? You have no motivation to leave. You can't leave, and, because you have cheap rent now. So if you left and you wanted to move to another part of the city even, you wouldn't do it because you'd have to give up that cheap rent. Now, for the people coming from out of town, with higher paying jobs, etc., you're going to have to get in a bidding war for a crappy apartment and pay way too much for it. Basically, they've discouraged people, the poor people, from moving out. They've discouraged the higher income people from moving in. They've created a perfect storm of garbage. And what's the end result going to be, okay? It's going to be population decline. And that should be pretty obvious, okay? These sort of socialist policies, they don't work. People don't like them. And even if they claim they do like them, in the long run, people, they vote with their feet, okay? What does that mean? That means they're going to move out of New York, move to places like Florida and Texas where they don't have these rules in place, because there, the people not only can afford housing, but they don't have to deal with all these rules and regulations. And maybe a place like New York, maybe that's what they need. They need to get a smack of reality when they see that population declining. I mean, we've already seen that in places like Chicago. The politicians there haven't learned their lesson yet, but they have seen that population decline, and their population will continue to decline, with too many rules, too many regulations, too much taxes, all of the crap that people don't want to deal with.